Okay, we've got a few people coming in right now, and we just wanted to wait a few minutes to see if we could get a few other attendees logged in. But we want to welcome you here at MaxGen to our webinar with Dr. Jennifer Curtis. She is a naturopathic medicine expert specializing in fertility and prenatal care. Dr. Curtis has a rich background in exercise physiology and naturopathic medicine. She's going to bring us some unique insights today into pregnancy support and preeclampsia prevention through gene optimization. In her practice, she's going to share a little bit more information how she practices with her patients, but today she's going to show and share with us some valuable expertise on optimizing prenatal health using a naturopathic and genetic approach. So I'm glad that everyone is here to join us, and I hope this session deepens your understanding in the role of genetics in pregnancy and health. So with that, I would love to turn it over to Dr. Curtis.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much for hosting me today. I'm very excited to share with you all my take on preeclampsia. In my practice, I've been practicing for 18 years now, specializing in preconception care and fertility. And I find that, support for pregnancy really begins before the pregnancy happens, during those months before pregnancy. So a lot of my attention and focus goes to that preconception time, starting at least 3 months before the intended pregnancy. So with all of that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. And there we go. Are you seeing this okay, Bobby?
Yes, we see it.
Okay, so here we go. We are going to talk today about supporting pregnancy and prevention of preeclampsia. So preeclampsia really entered the media this spring, tragically, when gold medalist Tori Bowie died during birth. She was 8 months pregnant. Through the autopsy, they determined that she died due to complications from preeclampsia and eclampsia. Eclampsia is a seizure that occurs, a tonic-clonic seizure that occurs from preeclampsia. Preeclampsia is the #1 cause of maternal death. So sadly, not only did Tori Bowie pass away, but 70,000 other women did as well in 1 year in our country. Black mothers are 60% more likely to develop preeclampsia compared to white mothers. It is defined as a sudden increase in blood pressure above 140/90, most often observed after 20 weeks of pregnancy. I always like to investigate what's happening around the world. Are 70,000 deaths unique to the United States? And so I found this epidemiological study looking at countries across the world and the rates of preeclampsia. So in Europe and Asia, the rates are pretty low compared to the United States. 5 to 7% in the United States of pregnancies end up or result with preeclampsia. And this made me pause for a second, because it's easy to assume that our rates would be similar to Europe, considering that we might have similar diets, similar healthcare. The rates were highest throughout Africa, varying from 11% to 23%, which is really high. Nutrient deficiencies are more common in Africa, so that was less of a surprise, but it made me pause, wondering, why are our rates higher in the US? And one thing that we do that those European and Asian countries do not do is enrich our flour with folic acid. And we'll talk more about that. It's something to think about. Okay, so our objectives today. Let me just move. I have all these faces in my way here. Okay, there we go. So our goals, objectives for today. I'm going to talk about the pathophysiology of preeclampsia, which then helps guide my approach and my treatment. I'll talk about the genetic SNPs that I use, which are associated with preeclampsia, to help me identify genetic risk predispositions, and that will allow us to be more proactive in our preventative health care. I'll talk about the support that I use for those genetic SNPs screening labs that I use during pregnancy. The tricky part about preeclampsia is that we don't see it until around 20 weeks or later, but the pathology of the disease begins at implantation. And then we'll talk about preventative measures. So you may not have preeclampsia, but we want to make sure that you don't throughout your pregnancy. We want you to be healthy, happy, and your baby to be healthy and happy. Let's see, sorry, I'm figuring out how to move my slides. There we go. What is preeclampsia? It's a progressive disorder resulting in high blood pressure and organ dysfunction that presents after 20 weeks of pregnancy. And it can even show up after pregnancy, after delivery, when you are postpartum. The condition is diagnosed when a pregnant or postpartum mother's blood pressure goes from being normal to greater than 140/90. As the condition progresses, it can cause organ damage and inhibit the growth of the spiral arteries that feed the placenta. So this is how the baby gets all their nutrition and oxygen for growth and development. The way I think about this, if you visualize your arteries as pipes or streams and you turn on the flow, so imagine a nice gentle stream, all of a sudden it's raging and flooding. That flood water is going to tear down trees and move boulders and rocks. And this is kind of what's happening in the pregnant mom's body. That high flow of blood is destroying organs and it's causing damage to the vessel lining, which then triggers an inflammatory response. So the symptoms that we'll see might be protein in the urine as that organ damage is occurring. Patients often, when the first symptoms I see, will describe a headache, just this like pulsating headache. Just think of lots of blood flow and pressure in your head, pulsating headache. They might start to have blurry vision, maybe shortness of breath because they're not getting all the oxygen that they need. Edema, they might find swelling, and this, some of these symptoms naturally occur in pregnant women, swelling of the ankles, but this would be swelling that you find all over. And in labs, there'll be signs of liver damage, elevated liver enzymes, and low platelets. Those platelets are being used up. A more severe form of preeclampsia, if that raging river continues, we'll start to see destruction of red blood cells, really elevated liver enzymes, and very low platelets. And then worst case scenario, the fetal symptoms can result in death, but we'll definitely see small babies. Those babies aren't getting the full nourishment, oxygen, and nutrients they need to fully grow and develop in the womb. Okay, next slide. So this slide, it's very busy. I'm gonna maybe have you start by directing your attention to that left box there with the orange and purple. So this is describing the pathogenesis of preeclampsia, how it develops and why it results in this high blood pressure around or after 20 weeks. So it really begins with the cells that attach the placenta to the uterine lining. Those are called trophoblasts. They're produced by the placenta, and they should grow and kind of dig into that uterine lining to help secure the placenta. This is the implantation. If that adherence is really shallow, then we're not going to have as many blood vessels connecting the mother's uterus to that placenta. And as a result, there's going to be decreased blood flow, oxygen, and nutrients to the baby. Around 12 weeks or later, with that decreased blood flow, the vessels will trigger this inflammatory response, releasing all these cytokines, these chemicals that then go into the bloodstream, enter the mom's bloodstream, and now we have this inflammatory reaction against the mom's blood vessels. So it's just this cycle that occurs starting at the trophoblasts, going to the baby, and then the baby's circulation sending those inflammatory cytokines to the mom. That will further damage the mom's vessels, creating more inflammation, and we start to see that high blood pressure. So the end stage takes a while to occur. All of this is silent, by the way. So this might be happening in a mom's body and she has no idea. She might feel fine. She's not having any obvious symptoms that this is going on. And this is why I call it a silent disease, because we don't see it until maybe 20 weeks, but the process has been happening on and on. And if things don't get under control, that cycle can continue. There's another form of preeclampsia that I want to mention. I'm going to talk a little bit less, but that's the form that causes when a mom with some type of metabolic condition, maybe she has diabetes, obesity, or high blood pressure to start, and then she becomes pregnant. The treatment difference is that right away we know that we need to control our blood pressure and our blood sugar, and she's going to get on medications for that instantly. Whereas in the silent version, nobody knows that this disease process is happening. And so it might be late or delayed to give that mom a blood pressure medication or blood sugar medication or something for inflammation and the nutrients that she needs. All right. So just to make my point again, preeclampsia does not begin at 20 weeks. That's when it typically shows up, but it begins at implantation. And, as a naturopath and a functional medicine doctor, I'm always thinking about the why. Well, why did the trophoblast not implant? Why was that a poor implantation that maybe led to a miscarriage? It really goes back to before pregnancy. So before pregnancy is when we want to prevent preeclampsia. As early as 3 days after fertilization, the trophoblasts from the placenta attach to that uterine lining. They also produce HCG and begin pregnancy. And I just want to take a minute here to mention miscarriage. So miscarriage can happen if that adherence, that trophoblast implantation is not deep, if it's just a very shallow implantation. And miscarriage can also happen if progesterone is too low. So progesterone helps stabilize that uterine lining. So if progesterone's low, we might see a shedding of the lining, miscarriage. Or if the trophoblasts aren't able to fully implant into that uterine lining, we might see miscarriage. And I think of miscarriage almost as a pre-symptom to preeclampsia. So lots of processes going on, physiologic processes. If we are to back up and think about how to support a really good implantation with those trophoblastic cells, I always think about nutrients and nutrition and diet. Folate is a very important B vitamin required for that trophoblast invasion into the uterine lining. If folate is deficient, this may not happen. B12 is also required to help those trophoblastic cells divide and grow and produce the vessels and make a nice, good implantation. Both B12 and folate are also required for DNA methylation to produce all the fetal cells. So the little baby's not going to fully develop if there's a deficiency in B12 or folate. Women with preeclampsia have been found to have lower levels of B12 and lower levels of folate. Methylation, I would define that term because it's basically the process that makes our DNA in all the cells in our body. It's the chemical modification of DNA essential to make and repair cells, and it's a basis for fetal growth. So if that process isn't going well, that can then affect fetal development. It's initiated by tetrahydrofolate, which is just leafy greens. So the folate we get from our leafy greens is what initiates DNA production. Miscarriage is associated with reduced trophoblast invasion, as I mentioned before. Elevated homocysteine levels have been associated with preeclampsia. This is an amino acid that needs B12 and folate to be broken down. So if it's elevated, it can cause a lot of inflammation in the cardiovascular system. I like to order it as a lab test just to evaluate B12 and folate deficiency. If it's elevated, it'll cause oxidative damage and stress to the endothelial lining of those blood vessels, resulting in increased inflammation and high blood pressure. So the number 2, 1 and 2 nutrients that we need to make healthy cells are B12 and folate. This is a diagram of that methylation cycle. It's kind of a lot to take in on a first glance, but let me bring you to that upper left corner. The circle on the left is the folate pathway. So we eat folate from our food. Every circle in this diagram is a nutrient that's used as a cofactor. A cofactor I think of as like a key that turns an enzyme on. And every square in this picture is an enzyme. So you'll see that folate from food uses B3 or niacin to then convert to 5,10-methyl tetrahydrofolate. That goes through the enzyme MTHFR, maybe you've heard of it, which needs B2 to function, to turn it on, to create our active form of folate, which is needed for that DNA replication, and that's called 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. Along with folate, we need methyl B12. So the circle on the right involves converting B12 into the methylated form, and homocysteine is abbreviated with HCY. So homocysteine is utilizing that B12 and that folate. It's like the circles are working together to make methionine. Methionine produces SAM. SAMe is a supplement that you might maybe see in the mood section. SAM is the methyl donor that helps us create our DNA strands. So the way I think about this is, if you imagine a beaded necklace, each bead is a protein on our DNA strand, and SAM helps add one more bead onto the necklace, and that's how we create those chains of DNA. All the other nutrients in that, and I'll go backwards, so if you quick look at all the nutrients in green, those are also essential for methylation. If the pregnant mom is deficient in any of these nutrients, that methylation process doesn't happen. So not only do we need B12 and folate, but we also need the cofactors magnesium, B2, B3, and B6. And then we need the chemicals in that methylation cycle that I just showed it before: choline, methionine, and arginine. I'm going to move forward to the next graph here. 2 more graphs down. Let's see there. This one might take a moment to load, but just to show you that choline, there it is. Another big circle, but if you see on the right, choline and betaine help convert that homocysteine to methionine, which is at the top of the right circle. And then methionine goes on to make SAM. So this is a larger picture, very busy picture of that methylation cycle. Every circle here is an enzyme. Everything written in green is a nutrient that's a cofactor. The circle on the left is the folate pathway. I don't expect anyone to take in all this information. It's very busy, but what I want you to know is that all the circles on the left, in the left circle, are involved in the pathway that makes our methylfolate. So this is the folate pathway. Our genes make these enzymes. And to keep it simple, the gene has the same name as the enzyme. So for example, in the middle, MTHFD1 gene makes the enzyme MTHFD1. If there's something wrong with that gene or something wrong with that enzyme, all the steps along the way get slowed down, and that can affect our ability to make methylfolate, also known as 5-MTHF. The same story happens on the right. I underlined MTR and MTRR, the 2 enzymes that make our methyl B12. If I back up, I'm backing up here just to the folate pathway, zoomed in a little bit. I underlined all of the enzymes that are also genes that I test through genetic testing. So the bottom enzyme, MTHFR, I feel like is the most famous. People hear about that a lot. And if you are only testing MTHFR, you would be missing all of the other enzymes and possible genetic defects that may be affecting your ability to make active folate. So it's really important when you're thinking about genetic testing to get a larger panel and test all the enzymes. Don't ignore DHFR or MTHFD1, because if there's a defect there and those enzymes aren't working, you're going to be deficient in your folate. That can affect your ability to get pregnant, have a healthy conception, increasing your risk for preeclampsia. So we're always thinking about the big picture. Okay, enough busyness here. I thought I'd better explain what a SNP is if I'm going to keep using this term. So a SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. If we go back to the analogy of the beaded necklace, each bead is a protein, also known as a nucleotide. And polymorphism is a fancy word for change. So if we take a single protein in that beaded necklace or that ring, that gene, and that one protein swaps places with another protein, that gene is going to be a little altered. The alteration in that gene, which is the blueprint to make an enzyme, is going to change the enzyme. We can use genetic tests to determine what kind of change occurs to that gene. So, for example, if you have a SNP in your MTHFR gene or MTHFR enzyme, the activity of that enzyme is going to be slow. It's not going to be as efficient. It's going to be moving like this instead of like this. That's how we read these tests. So if you're running a genetic test and you're looking at the activity in all of those genes or enzymes, you can determine where the body is susceptible, what pathways are either operating too fast, affecting all the downstream chemical reactions, or too slow, preventing the downstream chemical reactions from happening. SNPs occur in all humans naturally, we all have them, but we can use a person's individual genetic makeup to identify their susceptibilities to disease, such as preeclampsia, and then optimize those pathways to make those enzymes work better, make sure that the person has all the cofactors they need, and avoid exposure to anything that might further slow down that gene. And I just wanted, this is a lot of information, so I just wanted to make the statement that there will be time at the end for questions. So if you have questions about any of this, just write it down, take a little note. Okay. So this is a list of the genetic SNPs associated with increased risk of preeclampsia that I use in my practice. The Human Genome Project started in 1990, and that's when we started studying genes and learning about genes. And I just want you to know that these are not the only genes that are going to affect preeclampsia. There's lots of research on this condition. 70,000 deaths a year is a problem. So a lot of researchers are motivated to find out more. This is just my list that I've found to be really helpful and something that I can work with using diet and nutrition. So the top list to the left of that big red arrow are all the genes involved in that methylation pathway, that folate B12 pathway. So there's a lot. So you can see how if you were only looking at MTHFR, you could be missing a larger picture of what's happening. These genes have all been associated with increased risk of preeclampsia, the late stage condition called HELLP syndrome, eclampsia, which is the seizure condition, uteroplacental insufficiency, intrauterine growth restriction because they're not getting good circulation, recurrent pregnancy loss, gestational hypertension, placental eruption, neural tube defects, and Down syndrome. And the list goes on. And it makes sense that you would want to know if you had a defect in any of these genes because you don't want anything on the right to occur. All of these genes result in slowing of the enzyme. Now, some genetic SNPs will speed up enzymes, but in this case, all of these genes result in slow movement of those enzymes. For example, individuals with SNPs in their MTHFR gene can have almost 75% less available methylfolate due to the slow activity of all of those genes. There are a couple others in that methylation pathway that are involved in methylation pathway. PEMT produces choline. So choline was used in that methylation pathway to convert homocysteine to methionine. So we want to have good choline. BHMT is also in that pathway. It helps to regulate that homocysteine metabolism as well. There are a couple others that I use that I like to test that are not related to the methylation pathway. NOS3 helps us make nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a vasodilator. So if we don't get vasodilation, then there's going to be further constriction on top of the constriction that's already happening with the preeclampsia pathophysiology. So that's a good one. And I like to look at genes that we can support. So I'll get into that later, but each of these genes and these gene defects has something that we can work with. ApoE is a relatively famous gene. E2 and E4 are associated with increased risk of dementia and cardiovascular disease. If there is a family history of ApoE in the family, I like to dive into that because it tells me that there is that predisposition or that risk. I like to check this gene in my pregnant women as well so that we can be proactive at supporting the cardiovascular system and blood sugar. So metabolic conditions also have an increased risk with this gene defect. Methylation SNPs associated with preeclampsia. Here are a few specific details on some of the other genes, such as MTR. The genetic variant in either mother of fetus increases the likelihood of developing preeclampsia and intrauterine growth restriction. However, this risk goes down significantly when mothers supplement with adequate folate or just eat folate foods, which are all your leafy green vegetables. So leafy green vegetables in the diet can help modify an MTR gene SNP to reduce that risk of preeclampsia. I mean, that's pretty easy, right? Eat some leafy greens. Mothers with 2 copies, that means a homozygous SNP, 2 copies, of the MTHFD1 may have an increased risk of developing increased CRP. CRP can cause inflammation in the cardiovascular system. So if we see increased levels of CRP, there's an increased risk of intrauterine growth restriction associated with preeclampsia. And the MTRR SNP was found to be associated with preeclampsia, as placentas from preeclamptic pregnancies can have 50% less expression of the MTRR gene compared to normal pregnancies. I think I need to just point out too that the research that's happening right now is mostly happening in mice or cells. So we're not able to do a lot of research on pregnant moms unless we're looking at a population study. So I just want to make sure that's clear that none of this information was coming from a mother except in looking at a population study. All right, another interesting key is that research has found that a hereditary component to preeclampsia can come from both mom or dad. Both men and women born of a preeclamptic pregnancy are more likely to have a preeclamptic pregnancy of their own. I think this is a really important point demonstrating the genetic component of this condition. So if the dad of the pregnant mom was born from a mom who had preeclampsia, his baby is going to have an increased risk of that slow growth, and his wife or partner is going to have an increased risk of developing preeclampsia, even if she has no history of preeclampsia, no genetic increased risk, no family history. So we can't ignore dad ever when it comes to preconception health and even pregnancy. Mothers with the MTHFR C677T genetic variant may have up to 5 times the risk of developing preeclampsia when compared to mothers without a genetic variant. And this makes me wonder about the genes of our Olympic track star. She was a healthy, active Olympic runner, seemed healthy in all ways, but probably had some type of a genetic risk for preeclampsia. Okay, there's a lot of confusion out there about the word folate, so I just thought I would clear that up for everybody. Folate is B9. It's a B vitamin. I've been talking about it a lot already. And under the large category of folate, there are 3 different forms. There's folate that we get from our leafy greens in our food, also known, and you might see this even in a supplement, as calcium folinate or folinic acid. In the methylation cycle, it's often labeled as THF. There is methylfolate, which is the most bioactive form of folate, and the final product of our folate pathway that helps to make RNA and DNA. And then there's a man-made synthetic form of folate called folic acid that we started to add to our food in the United States around 1990. The reason that they began to put folic acid in our food in enriched flour was to prevent neural tube defects. We're also there. Okay. I'm just going to check the chat here in case anything's wrong. No. Okay.
No,
so
you're good.
We're good. Okay. All right. So enriched flour, we began to add to our food in the 1990s in an effort to prevent neural tube defects. The problem with kind of a global wide enrichment of either food or water. I think this has happened in some places with fluoride in the water as well, is that you're treating everybody, but not everybody can handle your treatment. So genetically, not everybody can process folic acid, synthetic folic acid found in our enriched flour. So I educate my patients to just think of folic acid as toxic. Unfortunately, it's the form of folate that's in most of our prenatals. And in the research, you'll read that folic acid supplementation reduces neural tube defects. And that is true in some people, but not in everybody. So we can estimate that about 50% of the population can't break down folic acid. The problem with eating folic acid, if I was to pretend like my hand here is a receptor, if you eat folic acid, it binds. It has more preference for the folate receptor on the cell, but we can't break it down. It doesn't work in our genetically defected mini folate enzymes. So if you're eating folic acid, you're going to further slow down these enzymes in the folate pathway that are already slow. It can increase the risk of developing folate deficiency. So actually supplementing with and taking folic acid can increase folate deficiency. And I see this all the time in my practice and new patients that come to me, as well as new patients that come to me for repeat miscarriage. The first thing I do is talk about their diet and look at all their supplements. And often there's a lot of folic acid in enriched flour, both in their prenatal and their supplements. And they had no idea, right? They thought they were doing the right thing, taking this synthetic, toxic, fake folate. So, just had to get that off my plate. So when I'm talking about folate, I'm referring to food folate or methylfolate, but I think it's wise to avoid folic acid. Okay, I think there, full slideshow. Okay, so you don't want to use folic acid if you're treating preeclampsia. The results show that supplementation of multivitamins containing folic acid decrease the risk of preeclampsia, while the supplementation of folic acid by itself had no significant effect. So I think this is important. A lot of times, if you're taking supplements or prenatal, you have other good nutrients to help support the folate pathway. One thing I see a lot are food-based supplements and food-based prenatals. So they'll have folate from food, but then to reach the RDA for pregnancy, they'll enrich that supplement with added folic acid. So the label of the supplement might be organic whole food nutrition for your baby, but then if you look at the fine print, you'll see that folic acid was added. And if someone just took folic acid alone, their risk for preeclampsia doesn't actually go down. I also found that studies are difficult to interpret because sometimes a study will use the word folic acid when they actually mean folate. And in this above study, food folate was called folic acid, when we know that folate from food is tetrahydrofolate or folinic acid. So they were even naming the food form of folate incorrectly. Sometimes a woman may still have a baby with neural tube defect despite having consumed folic acid. So this goes to my point that some people's genetics can't handle folic acid. It may help those who don't have defects in their folate pathway, but if they do, they're going to take that folic acid and probably still have a baby, unfortunately, with a neural tube defect. And then, as I mentioned before, folic acid has a higher affinity for the folate receptor binders than methylfolate. So if you have any of the folate SNPs, it's less able to convert that folic acid into the form you actually need, methylfolate. So in that case, it would probably be better to just take the methylfolate. And here's a study that demonstrates that folate insufficiency due to an MTHFR defect was able to be bypassed by just giving the methylfolate. This study was performed on lymphoblastic cells. So we still don't have human studies, but slowly things are changing. So if you have any of these folate genetic SNPs, or if you're worried about developing preeclampsia, or if you're worried about the health of your baby, this is what you can eat. Number one, just avoid folic acid. When in doubt, avoid folic acid. Eat the real food. Eat leafy greens. Your leafy greens will contain the folate that you need. If you supplement, you'll want to supplement with the folate that your body knows how to process, folinic acid or methylfolate. Magnesium is another nutrient that's essential. It's a cofactor in the folate pathway, and it also comes from leafy greens. So leafy greens, leafy greens. However, the other nutrients, B12, choline, methionine, B2, B3, and B6 primarily come with meat. And this is where I find it can be difficult for a patient who's a vegetarian or a vegan to get all those essential nutrients to help prevent preeclampsia and grow a healthy baby. For those patients, I recommend supplementing. Just make sure you're taking a really good prenatal, and I can talk about that at the end of this talk. What else I want to say here? Oh, one of my favorite protein sources and sources of all these nutrients, B12, choline, methionine, B2, B3, B6, are eggs. So I have a lot of vegetarians in my practice who do agree to at least eat eggs during the pregnancy. Eggs really are a superfood for pregnancy. The egg yolk contains choline. Choline is not only essential for that methylation pathway, but it's really essential for neurodevelopment in the baby. And it contains B12. B12 is kind of like iron. It's hard to get B12 from veggies. So it's another, you can, ensure that you're getting B12 and iron and choline and methionine and all of your amino acids if you just add a couple eggs to your diet. And there we go. My favorite pregnancy meal, a bunch of leafy greens, some legumes, and eggs. I didn't want to ignore the fact that there's a lot to diet in a pregnant woman. It's important to realize that metabolism is really high when you're pregnant and you're burning calories 24/7. Pregnant mothers need 2,750 to 3,000 calories. That's a lot of food, especially for someone who's not used to eating that much. And it really requires 3 meals during the day and 3 snacks. So I think when you're pregnant and you wake up, the first thing you should do is eat something little. Maybe it's just a banana or banana and peanut butter, and then you'll have your breakfast. Between breakfast and lunch, you're going to have another little protein fiber snack, and you'll have a snack between lunch and dinner, and then again before bed. If you follow that pathway of eating really every 2 to 3 hours, you're going to have a decreased risk of developing morning sickness, nausea. You really have to stay on top of that blood sugar. This is your time to do everything you can to enrich your baby. You can prevent disease in children by feeding them well during those developmental days and times in utero and then even postpartum. So eat organic. Organic food is higher in its nutrient content, its polyphenols, which we need to support our vessel health. And you're not putting in any toxins. So I'm a big fan of eating organic during pregnancy, and just eat real food, whole food diet. Avoid the processed food. It probably has folic acid in it anyways. So eating whole food is going to be your best bet. And then I like patients to follow the rule of thumb of making sure that every time you eat, you have protein, fat, and fiber. One food source that contains protein, fat, and fiber are nuts. So nuts are a great, quick, easy snack. You can have a mason jar. This is my favorite little snack, a mason jar on your desk that has your favorite dried fruits, your favorite nuts, and then maybe even a little dark chocolate in there. Dark chocolate is high in polyphenols, which is great at feeding your bacteria and also protecting your vessel health. If you are suffering from morning sickness and you can't eat that big plate of greens and eggs, a smoothie is kind of a good second meal, second bed. And there might be days when you just don't feel like eating. There might be days when you don't feel like taking your vitamins or your supplements or your prenatal. But bare minimum, try to at least have a green smoothie. If I was to choose a protein powder, my favorite is the whey protein isolate. It's lactose free, and it contains all the amino acids, all the essential amino acids. If you're not comfortable with whey protein, pea protein can be another option. And the one ingredient that should go into every single smoothie are 2 cups of leafy greens of your choice. Ginger and lemon juice can help with that morning sickness, and I think it helps to make the smoothie taste great. Add some nut butter, some frozen berries, a banana, half a banana helps to make that smoothie nice and creamy, a good consistency. Avoid adding juice to your smoothie, so stick to water or any of the milk substitutes. My favorite is coconut milk. Okay, so if we're looking at some genetic defects and we think that maybe we need to supplement with nutrients on top of eating that beautiful diet I mentioned above, this is my top 7 list. Choline, again, essential for fetal development, brain development. It should come from sunflower. So you can get phosphatidylcholine from soy. It's probably the most common form, but soy is a phytoestrogen. It can cause an increase in what's already a very high estrogen state. So stick to sunflower. Some prenatal vitamins add choline. Actually, quite a few will put choline in the vitamins, so you might be getting it already. If you can't supplement with choline or get it in your vitamin, eat eggs, 2 eggs a day. Folate. So with folate, you want to make sure, I think bare minimum, that you're taking 400 micrograms of methylfolate. My favorite prenatal has a combination of both the methyl and the calcium folate. So that's supporting that folate pathway from the top with the calcium folate to the bottom. Sometimes I'll find, patients will get this genetic information and they get worried that they need all these methyl donors, and they take really high doses of methylfolate or methyl B12 or both, and they feel terrible. And I'll talk to you about why that happens in a second, but just be careful that you don't overdo it. A good dose, rule of thumb, is 400 micrograms of methylfolate. And then in addition to that, you can eat your leafy greens. If you have some genetic defects, I would increase that dose to 600 to 800 micrograms. And everybody processes these nutrients a little differently. So you might not feel good with the higher dose. You might need less. B12, you should get 600 micrograms of a combination of both the methyl B12 and the adenosyl B12. Both are essential for fetal development. Another form of B12 you might see is hydroxy B12. That's a safe form of B12, but it's not essential specific to fetal development. And then the synthetic form that I would avoid is cyano B12, and that's the form that we often see enriched, similar to folic acid. So avoid that one. If you have macrocytic anemia, so that's anemia due to B12 or folate deficiency, you might need to get more folate in your body or more methyl B12 in your body through an intramuscular injection. So I will use these injections when patients are deficient and I want to get their levels up a little sooner than later. An intramuscular injection acts like a slow time release of nutrients into the bloodstream. It's especially great if the person has any digestive condition, if there's concern about their ability to absorb and digest food and absorb all the nutrients they need. You have to be careful with the methyl injections because, again, you can overdo it, and too much methylation will actually stop the folate pathway. Omega-3 fatty acids. It was found that when women with low omega-3 fatty acid content in their body had a 7.6 time increased risk of preeclampsia. Wow, that's a lot. Omega-3 fatty acids are good for so many things. I probably recommend these to everybody. They help protect your blood vessels. They're essential for neural development in that fetus. They're anti-inflammatory. And let's face it, they're really expensive. So this is the one supplement that I encourage people to spend their money on. There are some very poor quality supplements out there, and there's some poor quality fish oil that's made with farmed fish. It's high in mercury. So omega-3 fatty acids, this is one where I'm going to just recommend a couple over-the-counter brands that use small fish, clean fish. They test their fish oil for mercury. One brand is called Nordic Naturals, and another one is Carlson's. And they both are pretty easy to find over the counter. So 4,000 milligrams a day, which is typically equal to 4 caps or 4 teaspoons. L-arginine is an amino acid. It helps you to make nitric oxide, But I am always a little cautious about supplementing patients with amino acids. So if you supplement with one amino acid, you can cause deficiencies in another. This is why I prefer maybe full amino acid supplements, such as the whey protein powder. And if you cause too much vasodilation, that can result in a drop in blood pressure. So I pretty rarely ever prescribe L-arginine, but I do like beetroot powder. So beetroot powder, concentrated beets, will help you make nitric oxide, great for circulation, blood flow. I think that's all I want to say about that. Oh, wait, one more comment I have about L-arginine. If you supplement too much L-arginine, you can cause a deficiency in lysine, and that can increase the risk in a herpes outbreak in somebody who has herpes. So another reason to maybe be cautious with that one. All right, next slide. So too much of a good thing. Going back to the overmethylation. Multiple studies correlated increased risk of recurrent pregnancy loss with overmethylation. So this, I feel like, there'll be some kind of information discovered, and then supplement companies will make a supplement based on that research. And this happened with MTHFR and elevated homocysteine. Supplement companies started to make supplements with really ultra high doses of methyl B12, and it's too much. And the way I think about it is the B12 jams up the pathway. A study in mice revealed that diet with high folate and low B12 also increased the rate of death. So you can't just give one or the other. You need to give both, and you need to keep the doses in moderation, or you're going to get in trouble. You're going to jam up this whole pathway. Excess SAMe derived from methyl B12 and methylfolate turns off methylation. This is huge. So too much methyl B12 and folate stops your whole methylation pathway. How do you know this is happening? I probably can't blow this up, but the pathway, the very busy pathway on your left, is our neurotransmitter pathway. And I want you to zoom in to norepinephrine right in the middle. Norepinephrine gets broken down through the enzyme COMT. COMT needs SAMe or SAM and magnesium to turn it on as a cofactor. Imagine you have a lot of stress and you're developing a lot of norepinephrine. And then the enzyme that breaks down that norepinephrine gets turned off. Well, you're going to have a lot more norepinephrine, which will look like rage, irritability, anxiety, insomnia. So the symptom I see in my practice from too much methylation is a really unusual, sudden, revved up, overwhelmed, ragey feeling and increased blood pressure. So here we are trying to decrease the raise in blood pressure. We're giving methylated nutrients. We're trying to prevent preeclampsia, and then all of a sudden the blood pressure spikes. And I saw this happen once in a patient of mine who had multiple methylation defects. I was supplementing her, giving her food and B injections 1 day a week. Her homocysteine was still high, and the nurse at the hospital decided, well, let's just give you a B injection every day. That B injection every day resulted in heart palpitations, a big spike in her blood pressure, insomnia, anxiety. She felt terrible. It was too much of a good thing. So I just want you to watch out for that. Be cautious. And if you're supplementing, even if you're taking a prenatal and you start to notice that, oh, God, I'm starting to feel like really revved up. I'm having anxiety. I can't turn my brain off at night. I can't fall asleep. That might not be the best prenatal for you. Or maybe instead of 4 caps, you drop it to 3 or 2. So be careful with overmethylation. We need these nutrients, but too much of a good thing can cause problems. And it can turn off the breakdown of your adrenaline. Okay, so screening for preeclampsia risk. I have a lot to say about this. I love genetic testing. There are a lot of different tests out there that you can use. I usually break it down to 2 options for patients. But I think genetic testing can be a really helpful way to identify risk and to start treating people for that risk right away. Why wait? Why wait until week 12 of pregnancy? Let's start preconception. So in all my fertility patients, I require that they do some genetic testing. Max Gen Labs has a test that I like to use called the Max Function Panel. It's a really concise panel. They do a great job at educating patients. You get a report that's about 15 pages long, and it's easy to read, and it gives me a lot of information that I can act on immediately with my patients for prevention. It does measure all those different genes in the folate pathway. So it's like the 10 different enzymes that we talked about in that folate pathway. You would get that information there. Super helpful. It's just a simple cheek swab. You pop it in the mail, and it's information that you can use for the rest of your life. I mean, those are your genes, and the risk is part of your genetic makeup. I also think it's fun for parents to do genetic testing because it tells them a little bit about their children. One other thing that Max Gen Labs does that people like is that they discard a patient's genes. So those genes don't go on for future research. So that gives people a lot of peace of mind. Another test that patients will request when they want a lot of information, this is a test for my biochemists or people that like research and have that kind of biochemical brain. They get a report that's about 130 pages, 150 pages versus 15 pages. This test is called the Stratagene test. It does require that you get your raw genetic data from either Genetic Genie or 23andMe or Ancestry.com. I just learned recently that 23andMe was hacked. Those companies also take your genetic information and they use it for research. So there are definitely pros and cons to each, but I think the Max Function Panel really gives you what you need when you're thinking about something like preeclampsia risk. Blood labs. I'm a fan of doing blood draws. It's quick, easy, you get the results fast. I always include homocysteine, which is a good assessment for B12 and folate. Methylmalonic acid is a B12 dependent enzyme. So if that is really high in the blood, that can indicate a B12 deficiency. Serum B12 and folate is not very accurate. That includes all forms of folate that's circulating in your bloodstream, but it doesn't really tell us what's getting inside the cells. So I find homocysteine and methylmalonic acid to be more accurate. CRP is an inflammatory marker. Hemoglobin A1C is a glucose marker over a 3-month period of time. It's glucose bound to a red blood cell. Red blood cells live for 3 months, so it gives us that 3-month average glucose measurement. CBC is really inexpensive, and it's also a good way to just assess for nutrient deficiency. Macrocytic anemia, which I mentioned before, is a form of anemia that creates these large, bubbly red blood cells, and the values MCV, V for Victor, MCH, and MCHC will all be elevated. So that's describing a very large red blood cell, which will tell me that you're deficient in B12, folate, or B6 can do that as well. So that's an easy test. You can act on it right away. If red blood cells and hemoglobin and hematocrit are all low, indicating anemia, you can also measure ferritin, which is iron storage. So if you want to differentiate between an iron deficiency and a B12 folate deficiency, ferritin is a good thing to add. I like looking at ferritin instead of or on top of iron because ferritin, the storage levels will go down before the iron levels. So it's almost like a preview. You're looking at the preview to an iron deficiency that's developing, but maybe not showing up yet. So your red blood cells might still look normal, but that ferritin level is going down. If ferritin is below 50, sometimes even below 60 in a patient, I will start giving them iron. Regular blood pressure checks. I mean, the preeclampsia starts so suddenly. If you're not checking that blood pressure, you might not know it's happening. If the blood pressure is high, we can be proactive and give that a blood pressure medication on top of all the nutrient support. Common symptom, again, headaches, edema, blurry vision, shortness of breath, appetite, morning sickness. So morning sickness would indicate that maybe this person isn't getting all the nutrients that they need because they don't feel good and they're not eating. That would include appetite. If they have no appetite or low appetite, I'm going to be really concerned about their nutrient status. And then, of course, I always talk about family history. Did your mom have preeclampsia? Did your husband's mom have preeclampsia? Do you have any history of heart disease, metabolic disease? Those are really important questions. A history of miscarriage, all of those issues. So that's pretty easy and relatively low cost screening that we can do something about right away. So if you're pregnant and you're wanting to know what else you can do, this is kind of my top list for treatments that are supportive. Very hard to go wrong with any of these. Omega-3 fatty acids I mentioned before, essential to building cell membranes, fetal neural development. They reduce placental inflammation. So if you're having that preeclampsia pathology that's creating the inflammatory cytokine surge, you can take fish oil to help calm that down. And they reduce allergies after birth. Probiotics were found to decrease the inflammatory response in the female placenta when mom supplemented with Lactobacillus rhamnosus and Bacillus subtilis. Lactobacillus and Bacillus are two strains of bacteria that are part of the first development of growing a baby's microbiome. So those are good probiotics to supplement. It's been found that a mom who supplements with probiotics will then pass those strains of bacteria into her vaginal flora. So the baby will get that flora when they're born through the birth canal. And these probiotics come out through mom's milk. So it's pretty good. Like a lot of supplements, there are some poor probiotics over the counter. Recently, there were probiotics given in the hospital, and you probably all heard about this in the media, but one led to a death of a baby in the hospital. So I'm really picky about brands when it comes to fish oil and probiotics, really about all supplements. There are several brands out there. Feel free to send me a message or ask questions if you're wondering about what probiotic to take or what brand to use. Progesterone, I talked about how low progesterone can result in shedding of that uterine lining. There's some evidence showing that progesterone given during the first trimester reduces the risk of gestational hypertension. Interesting that that also affects blood pressure. Progesterone is something I have patients check right away. We check it, of course, before conception. Ideally, it should be measured around day 21 of the menstrual cycle. You know, I can give a window of day 18 and day 23, have your blood drawn to check progesterone. That's when it should be at its highest point. I like to see progesterone around 20 or higher if we're looking at preconception health in a healthy pregnancy. But even after testing it preconception, I'll have patients test again, have their blood drawn again right when they're pregnant. We check progesterone and HCG. If that progesterone is low, I'm going to go ahead and give them progesterone, either oral or vaginally. Digestive enzymes are suppressed during pregnancy, which can then aggravate digestion and absorption of all those essential nutrients that we've talked about. So digestive enzymes are another common recommendation. I think it's important to support digestion from the top down. So you want to include HCl, a stomach enzyme, your pancreatic enzymes, and bile salts. In patients who have any of the above methylation defects, there's an increased rate of developing a gallbladder condition. And I think it's related to the slow detoxification of all these hormones that are being produced and estrogen. So I commonly see constipation in these people. We want to keep things moving, and the way to keep your bowels moving is with bile. So bile salts, they are harvested from animals, usually ox. You'll see ox bile. It's actually harvested from ox, but they can be really helpful. If you can't take bile salts or you don't want to take bile salts, my favorite food for gallbladder support are beets. So beets help thin the bile in your gallbladder. I often have patients when they're pregnant to eat half a beet a day. It could be pickled, fresh, however you like it. But bile, not only does it lubricate our stool and help prevent constipation, it's also essential for absorbing fats and all of our fat-soluble nutrients. including vitamin D, which is another nutrient that I supplement that I didn't mention here, so vitamin D. And polyphenols. Polyphenol-rich foods are antioxidants. They support circulation, but they also help feed good bacteria in our gut. And that good bacteria is going to be passed down to our babies. So we want to support that as well. Exercise. It's huge. Regular aerobic exercise in pregnant women reduce the risk of preeclampsia, preterm birth, and cardiovascular disease. The general rule with exercise is not to pick up anything new, but just keep moving your body in a way that's comfortable. If you're a walker, keep walking. You want to get your heart rate up. You want to increase that circulation, so maybe try walking uphill. Sometimes during pregnancies, our bodies stretch and grow. There's a lot of pressure on that pelvic floor, and walking can be really difficult or painful. That was the case for me. I had a hard time walking, and I found that riding a cruiser bike was the best thing for me. So this is me, a picture of me on the left. How many years ago? 14 years ago, riding a bike. And this cruiser bike was my savior. It allowed me to move my body. It was my transportation. It took the weight and pressure off of my pelvic floor, and I could still get my heart rate up. So whatever is your movement of choice, swimming can also be really comfortable for pregnant women, but you want to keep your body moving. Okay, that's my top list. Food for thought. As you're researching this topic, you're going to read over and over about the importance of supplementing folic acid, 400 micrograms a day to prevent neural tube defects, to prevent preeclampsia. And I think that's because that's the only research we have. The argument against not supplementing with methyl tetrahydrofolate is that it's not in the research, but we don't perform studies on pregnant women. So hopefully over time, as more and more pregnant women decrease their consumption of folic acid and instead consume methylfolate, we'll start to see trends dropping with reduced preeclampsia rates and neural tube defects as well. So you can read that. That's just my thought about why we're reading certain things in the research. Okay, in summary, preeclampsia is a disorder that begins at implantation, or before that, at preconception. If we're really thinking about maybe preeclampsia starts with genes or genetics that aren't supported. We can test genetics and lab markers to identify and support any susceptibilities. Most importantly, please avoid folic acid and enriched flour. I mean, we don't need junk food anyways, right? So maybe just eat your leafy green salad every day. Make sure you have a big leafy green salad. And my favorite protein source, eggs. And I think that's the end. I am now going to open it up to questions. And maybe I don't know if should I turn on the Q&A, or Bobby, are you going to read questions to me?
Yeah, I'll just read. Right now we only have one. I know we still have a few attendees here, but someone is asking if you would mind sharing your favorite prenatal.
Yes. There's only one prenatal that I have found that contains both methylfolate and folinic acid. It's really hard to find that combination, and it's called Optimal Prenatal. It's by Seeking Health. They are a company that makes a lot of supplements geared towards genetic support. The dose on that prenatal is 8 caps. That's a lot. That's a lot of capsules to take in a really loaded prenatal. So I often will have patients start with 4 caps or 6 caps, and I recommend splitting those caps up into a breakfast and a lunch dose. Great question.
Let's see. Is there a large difference from eating leafy greens raw versus cooked?
The cooked leafy greens will have a reduced level of nutrients, but I am not picky. I think if you're eating the food, you're getting the nutrients, and I try to keep everything simple for patients. I don't want to make the treatment plan too picky. Certain gastrointestinal conditions make it hard to digest raw leafy greens, so I have a large part of my practice is involved in gastrointestinal health, chronic intestinal infections. Many of my patients cannot eat raw vegetables, so cooked is fine if that's what you can do, but make sure that you're checking your homocysteine and your CBC to monitor your B12 and folate status to make sure you're getting enough nutrient.
Okay. And we have another question. It's asking, what is the best way to improve preeclampsia postpartum?
All the same. Continue taking your prenatal, continue taking all of the supplements, nutrition, the folate foods, and B12. Your doctor might recommend blood pressure meds. I think it's important to get that blood pressure down as soon as possible to prevent all the organ damage. So blood pressure medication, of course, but don't change anything that you're doing postpartum.
Do you see a typical time frame that preeclampsia resolves postpartum, or is it different for every person?
Definitely different for every person, and I think it depends on their level of care. I have seen patients get stable in the hospital and then sent home without all the support, and boom, their blood pressure goes right back up and they end up back in the hospital. So whatever support you're getting in the hospital, whether it's diet, nutrition, blood pressure meds, make sure you have somebody at home available to help you continue that care. A lot can fall off when patients leave the hospital.
That's great.
But usually, I guess about the timeline, like it should resolve in a week.
Okay. All right. And another question just came in. What would you consider a healthy blood pressure? What do you see in your practice?
Oh, I definitely like, 110/80. The literature will say a healthy blood pressure is anything under 120/80. The top number, your systolic blood pressure, is the number related to your heart at contraction, but it's also the number that's most related to stress. Whereas the bottom number tells me more about the health of your vessels. So the 80, the bottom number, I will watch a little more closely. You probably have heard of the white coat syndrome. Blood pressure goes up in the office. That's more of a stress response, and I'm less concerned about that. So if that bottom number gets above 80, we're going to be proactive.
Okay. All right. I think that was the last question. Is there any others that want to come through before we close out for the day? No. And Vanessa, who put in some of those questions, said thank you. So we really appreciated you today, Dr. Curtis. Let me turn my video back on. I'm not a ghost voice in the background. We will have this recorded and we will get it uploaded in a couple of days for those that may have joined us late or didn't get a chance to grab this live. So that will be posted and everybody will be notified of that. And Dr. Curtis will, of course, share it with her community and her audience as well. And if there's any questions, feel free to contact us at help@maxgenlabs.com and we'd be happy to connect you with Dr. Curtis if you have any further questions or you're interested in possibly becoming a patient of hers.
Thank you, everybody, for your time. Thanks for having me, MaxGen.
Okay, we will talk to you soon, and thanks everybody for joining.
Bye.
Bye-bye.